Hello everyone, welcome to the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska. My name's Tim Matthews. I'm the curator of the museum, and I'm so very honored today to introduce you to a great friend of not only the museum, but also to Speedway Motors, and dare I say it, a friend to many people in racing, Bob McKee. And Bob's such a great and humble man, but what we wanted to do today is to get together, sit in front of a car that he has his fingerprints on. This is the 1958 Monza winning A.J. Watson Roadster car, and we wanted to talk a little bit about Bob's wonderful career and what made him successful over the many decades he was involved in motorsport, and just learn a little bit more about the man whose name is on a few cars around here at the museum and who is very well known around the racing community. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob McKee, and thanks, Bob, for being here.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, this is obviously a real honor for us, and you're no stranger to the museum. When I had asked you yesterday, you said you'd been here before. How many times would you say you've been here to the museum?
Oh boy, I try to come every couple of years. My daughters live in Colorado, so this is a perfect stop along the way, and every time I come it's better and bigger and nicer than I was the time before.
Oh, well, that's nice of you to say, and I know Chicago has always been your home. Is that correct?
Yes, right.
And were you born in Chicago?
Yes.
Okay, and that was your home base for all of your racing endeavors for a long time, but you did have a foray that kind of took you here to Lincoln, Nebraska. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so tell me, I think as a car person, we're all bit by the car bug at some point in our lives. When did that happen for you? Do you have a time where you could put a finger on it and say, that's when I became interested in cars?
Oh, probably when I was 12, I was buying Hot Rod magazine, and they were 25 cents then, and about a third of or a quarter of what they are now for size. But anyway, I read those when I should have been studying English and other things. But that kind of got a lot of people started in automobiles and hot rodding.
Well, when you look at your amazing career and some of the cars that you've worked on, not only race cars, Indy cars, NASCAR, Can-Am, I could just go on, and I'll be the first to say that this interview is just barely going to scratch the surface of what we could actually make this a 20-part series. I know we could go into a lot of detail on almost every project you've worked on, but it all started with basically a passion. I think I'd asked you, were you a good student in school? Were you like the math whiz? Or
not so
like
much,
that?
No. I enjoyed physics and mathematics a little bit, but I just wasn't a very good student. It was easier to take an engine apart and look at it, figure out how it worked, and put it back together again.
Yeah, the hands-on tactile stuff.
Right.
And we talked a little bit about that. I have a son who is 9 years old, and we talked about the importance of just getting in there and doing something, and getting greasy and not being afraid of taking something apart. And I think that's really interesting. Now, the car that kind of started it all was it a Model A pickup that you were working on?
Yeah, a 29 Model A pickup that I paid $55 for. And it was in pretty good shape, but I, refinished all the fenders and painted it and put a V8 engine in it and a Roadster convertible top on it. And, I had that when I was 15, and
wow,
it was a wonderful life for a kid to be able to have a car or vehicle.
And parts in those days, I know it's a little bit different than today, but back then Ford parts were pretty available. Is that right? So
yeah, junkyards had stacks of Model A's and parts. That was before they were melting everything down, and it disappeared right away.
Oh, sure. What kind of engine did you have in your little pickup?
I put a V8 flathead in it.
Okay.
But then later on, when I was a senior in high school, I got a Model A coupe, and I put a Olds Rocket 88 engine in there.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, so you're no stranger to hot rodding. And I think what's interesting, as I've been so lucky to talk to you over the last day or so, hot rodding's been kind of a common theme in your life. I mean, despite your cars being amazingly complex and exotic, it's always been from a hot rodder's kind of way of thinking. And we'll get to that a little bit more as we go, but that's what's so fascinating to me. So this hot rod, this Model A, is kind of what opened the first door for you. You got a job in Chicago, right, for a speed shop? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, at Ray Erickson's Speed Shop. When I got out of high school, they offered me a job at Erickson's, and a friend of mine worked there already. And so we were working on a Hudson stock car and building flathead engines. And that was really my first taste of being a full-time professional.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. And then that speed shop job caused you to, that connection, somehow Speedy Bill Smith plays into that. How'd that all work out?
Well, Bill used to come by, and Ray Erickson was kind of a mentor to Bill, and because he had a speed shop for years before Bill had started his.
Wow.
And so he had a lot of experience, and they became friends, and then because of that, I became friends with Bill and Joyce, and ended up out here.
I love it. And over dinner last night, we talked a little bit about what the early days were like. And I've worked at Speedway Motors for about 15 years or so, and I know Speedway as a big mail order company with the big warehouse and a lot going on. But when you came to Lincoln, it was mostly for school. Is that right? You were studying at the University of Nebraska?
Well, no, it ended up. Marv Koppel, it was an old friend of Bill and Joyce's. They went to grade school together.
Oh.
And he had a 55 Chevrolet stock car that we built at Ray Erickson's.
Oh.
And so I would end up out here if we were racing Nebraska and Iowa, and if there was time between races, Bill let us use his shop to work on the car.
Oh, that's great.
To make the next race. So that's how I got to know Bill and Joyce. And Tiny Lund ended up buying that car, and so I was already working on it, and Tiny said, well, you come on along, we'll go racing. So that's...
Oh, wow. And you guys have become great friends, which we'll talk about in just a second, but tell me a little bit, you were explaining it a little bit last night, what was the Speedway Motor shop like? What, in those early days, would have been 1955, 56?
Yes, right. Well, it was 1719 N Street, and it had a storefront and a little shop in back, and Bill had his 4X modified stock car in there, and selling parts, putting mufflers on cars, and it was no mail order. He had to order stuff and have it sent in for customers when they needed a part, and he had quite a bit on the shelf. So he and Joyce built up this business from nothing, and done a wonderful job with it.
Well, and I imagine what that shop would have been like, what the equipment would have been like. And yesterday, I think you explained to me that really there wasn't a lot in there. When you finally bought the Pontiac and rolled it in to make that '56 Pontiac into a race car, I think you said he had a grinder and just some basic tools, and not a lot of heavy-duty equipment at that time.
No, things were simple, and in those days the stock cars were stock.
Yeah.
There wasn't too much you could modify except put in heavier hubs or axles and safety features and a roll bar. They didn't even have roll cages in those days.
So it made the fabrication pretty simple, and life was pretty simple. I think you were telling me about one day Joyce prepared dinner for you guys, for you and Tiny. Tell me a little bit about what that was like. Well,
Joyce invited us over for dinner just before we left with the car to go down south to run the NASCAR races. And she and Bill were living above a 4-car garage in one of the back streets in Lincoln here. And she said, we haven't got much, but we've got some peanut butter and jelly. So anyway, we went over, Tiny and I and Tiny's wife went over there for dinner. And she had the biggest bottle of peanut butter I ever saw, and a jelly to match. And she went in to change one of the kids' diapers and came back, and Tiny had taken that bottle of peanut butter and hid it behind the couch.
Oh boy.
And she's looking all over the kitchen and the house, and I can't figure out where I put that peanut butter. Tiny said, is this what you're looking for? But he was always pulling stunts like that.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, and that was dinner, for the whole gang, and humble beginnings, and I think that's a pretty interesting side of the story.
Well, we were in hog heaven. We were doing what we wanted to do and getting ready to go racing, and everybody had big ambition and
love it.
No money, but a lot of ambition.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a fly on the wall. And of course, it's funny how, Tiny ended up, he started racing the 55 Chevy that you were talking about, which would have been a brand new car. And then you were looking for another car to go racing in, and you were kind of surveying what was out there. And it wasn't the Pontiac that you chose first, right? It was a different car.
No, Tiny said, we'll build any car that you think you want to build. So I said, that Studebaker Hawk looks like it's a good one. It's a small frontal area and a fairly small light car, and it has the big Packard engine in it.
Yeah.
It was a Golden Hawk. And so Tiny said, well, I'll order one. And so he ordered one and went to South Bend, Indiana, where they were made, to pick it up. And he got as far as the middle of Iowa, and he called up and said, Bob, we've got to do something different. I blew up the engine and didn't even get through Iowa yet. So then we ended up getting a Pontiac.
Wow. Did they take the Hawk back just with the blown engine? Did they ask any questions, or was it, in those days, I always wondered
Tiny handled all that, and I don't know how that came out. I think it was on warranty. He probably had it flat out anyway just to make sure it was going to run.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's funny. So then you decided on the Pontiac, and how did that car run? Was it a pretty strong runner?
Well, Pontiac wasn't seriously in racing at that time. Chevrolet was putting a lot of money in it and help. Mm-hmm. So we got the Pontiac, and we were racing against two factory-sponsored cars that Lou Moore, that he was an IndyCar builder, was in charge of the Pontiac race team at that time.
Oh, sure.
And so we outran them quite a few times, and we didn't have any money, and we had to finish races to get enough money to buy a hamburger and gas to get home on. And
sure.
Tiny, people used to say you could break an anvil with a rubber hammer. So he had to calm down and make the thing last through the race so we'd get some money to get home on.
Oh, sure. Oh, that's pretty interesting. And you were the guy that made all the behind the scenes stuff work. So if he tapped the wall, you were the guy to straighten out the fender and keep the engine running. Was Tiny much of a mechanic, or was he?
Yeah, he would help.
Yeah.
But it was really up to me, and we didn't have any helpers or stooges. If something broke, we had to fix it before the next weekend when there's another race.
I try to put myself in the shoes of a young Bob McKee. It would have been 1956. You're working on that car. Were you already thinking about what comes next, or were you just happy in that moment, working?
I was happy in that moment, because that was, working on new cars was a lot nicer than working on modifieds and old cars.
Sure.
So that was kind of a step up, but my ultimate goal was to do Indianapolis cars and get involved with that.
So that was all that had been in your mind at that time, to already look ahead.
Well, that was the top of the mountain.
Oh, sure.
Where you wanted to arrive, hopefully someday.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another question I was going to ask you a little bit about NASCAR, because it ties in pretty nicely. I think you had told me that the gang of people around NASCAR at that time, the early days when things were still a little rough and tumble. Do you have any stories you could tell about going down south, and were there any culture shocks from being somebody from Chicago going down to?
Well, being from Chicago, and Tiny was from Harlan, Iowa, we were Yankees. And down south they didn't like Yankees too well, but anyway, they were still thinking the Civil War was on, I think. But anyway, we went down there, and a lot of the race drivers were involved with bootlegging.
Sure.
Junior Johnson being a prime example, but I ended up working on some Pontiac bootleg cars, and because we fixed the carburetor so it could turn left and not stagger and run out of fuel. So
Sure.
we put some baffles in the carburetor, and that made them work. And the bootleggers noticed that, and they were using the Pontiacs as bootleg cars because they were pretty big, and they'd take the seats out and they'd stack the liquor cases all up even with the windows and
sure.
fill the trunk. And so from a kid from Chicago living in the suburbs, this was all stuff you read about in comic books. I didn't know it really happened for real.
Oh boy, I bet that was it. You know, people like Fireball Roberts, and you know, what kind of other cars would have you been racing against with that Pontiac? I would imagine there were a bunch of Chevys. And,
Well, Holman Moody was doing the Ford thing.
oh sure.
And you know, Fireball Roberts, and there were still a lot of Hudsons running, but Fords and Chevys were really the main competition, and Keycaver, that had Mercury Marine that makes the outboard engines, had some Chrysler 300s,
oh yeah.
and those kind of dominated, and Buck Baker won the championship one year in the Chrysler 300.
Wow. You know, we could go on in NASCAR because it's such a fascinating area, but how did that all come to an end for you with Tiny and the Pontiac, and tell me about that.
Well, it was a rather abrupt end. Tiny had financed the car at a bank here in Lincoln, and he'd missed some payments, needless to say. And I had financed a Chevy station wagon that we were dragging it around the country with. And I was trying to make payments on that. And but Tiny fell far behind on the Pontiac. And so we were at the racetrack at Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and a repo man came up and said, "I'm supposed to take this car back." Oh. And so he said, "Well, let us finish the race," because you know that was, we qualified and everything. So he said, "Okay, I'll watch the race and we'll take it after the race." So anyway, Tiny kind of drove it over the fence and tore the drive shaft out and the cross member.
Oh boy.
And so the guy said, "Well, I don't think I can take it back with it torn up." And I said, "Well, we'll fix it and we'll run the next race and you can pick it up, I think at Hickory, North Carolina." So we fixed it up and ran it the next weekend, and here's this repo man.
He showed up.
He showed up again with a tow bar to drag it home. So that put Tiny and I out of the race business with the Pontiac.
Isn't that interesting? You know, I can't imagine a day when they would come to a racetrack and repossess a car that had been raced, and well, I wonder what they did with it after that, if it went to...
I have no idea, because you know, it was easy to see. It had a 37 on the door, and it was kind of wrinkled here and there and had a roll bar in it, and we only drove it on Sundays.
Nobody's going to use that for a family car. I love it. So that ended the whole NASCAR foray. You know, I guess I'd never asked you if you had other encounters with NASCAR racing, you know, throughout the years, but then what did you do immediately after that then, once the car got repossessed and you had to move on?
Well, the Pontiac deal with Lou Moore was still racing in NASCAR and AAA.
Oh, sure.
And so they'd use Indy drivers in the AAA races, and Dick Rathman was driving the car in some of those. And he offered me a job, so I threw the toolbox in the back of the station wagon and headed to Indianapolis, where his shop was. And then he died of a heart attack at a racetrack at Atlanta. And so his nephew took over, Howard Moore, and ran the Pontiac thing.
Okay.
And we ran both NASCAR and AAA.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's kind of how you got involved with that, and obviously you'd made a good name for yourself as a loyal, reliable guy fixing things. I know Bill wouldn't have kept anybody around, Bill Smith that is, unless they knew what they were doing. So yeah, I knew right away, even at an early age, you were a go-to guy, and people realized that there was a lot of value in having you around. So then, how did the military play into all this? Because I know for a while you had to go overseas. When did that happen?
Well, in that time, people were drafted, and I got this notice in the mail that says report for a physical and bring your toothbrush and razor because you might go to boot camp.
Oh boy.
Right away. So I went down and did the physical, and they said, we'll call you in a couple of weeks, and then I went out to Colorado and did basic training there. But you were drafted for 2 years, whether you wanted to or not. And you know, I was racing and doing what I wanted to do and loving it. And here I had to go away for 2 years.
Oh boy, yeah, like a big pause button in your life.
Yeah, big pause button.
So did they understand in the military your aptitude for fixing things? How did that all play out?
Well, I knew if I told them that I was a race car mechanic, I'd end up in the motor pool working on deuce-and-a-half trucks, changing oil in them. And I thought, I better make it sound like I was doing something exotic. So
sure.
I told them we were building race cars and fabricating things, and you know, but it wasn't just a mechanic. So
sure.
they decided that I ought to be atomic weapons forward assemblyman.
Wow.
So they sent me to Albuquerque and sent me to school there to learn how to put nuclear weapons together.
Wow.
So I was a forward assemblyman on nuclear weapons for 2 years, and you know, for Honest John and Corporal missiles and the 280 millimeter cannon. It was different, but you know, it's all nuts and bolts, and but you got uranium in there and some dangerous stuff, and it makes a big bang when it goes off.
It's not like in the movies where if you touch the red wire to the green wire, you take out half of a state or anything like that.
Well, if two people cooperated, they could probably do that.
Oh boy. Yeah, I think in all the things that put me in awe, and there have been many that we've talked about, that's probably one of the parts of your story that put me in awe. You know, just I always knew there had to be somebody putting that stuff together, but then to meet somebody that actually had their hands on that stuff, it's pretty interesting. So you were overseas doing that particular task when there was a lot of racing going on, and you told me that you had a lot of spare time. And what did you get to do on your weekends? And
oh boy, I'd never had so much spare time in my life. And so I knew that the Indy cars were going to come over and run at Monza. And I had worked for A.J. Watson on some of his cars as a stooge, just helping around washing parts and helping him put stuff together. And so I knew they were coming to Monza, and I thought that'd be neat to take a leave and go down there. So I got a 2-week pass and took the train down from Frankfurt, Germany to Italy, and went to the racetrack, and AJ said, do you have time to help us? You want to work on the car? And I said, boy, that'd be neat. I'd love to.
Oh, wow.
So ended up helping him on this car, and coincidentally, Jim Rathman was driving it, who I'd known before anyway, because his brother Dick was a good friend of mine, and he won the race in this car at 158 miles an hour.
Wow. For
500 miles, which the track was really, really rough. I mean, it was a concrete track, and it had done a lot of settling, and where the cracks in the concrete were, really shook the cars badly, and a lot of cars had cracks in the frame from running over those cracks, and fuel tanks were leaking, and oil tanks, and
oh boy.
and you had an hour between races to refuel and go back to run the next section.
Yeah.
And Enzio Ferrari was there with bunch of his cars, and Maserati was there. Sterling Moss was driving a Maserati.
Wow.
So it was a collection of race drivers from all around the world. It was an interesting group.
I bet. At that time, did you kind of pinch yourself? And when you saw all these people, and it's obviously some very exotic stuff, you know, and I couldn't imagine that. Or was it more like, hey, these are my people. This is the kind of group
No, I
that
thought
like
this
to
is
be
what I want to do.
Yeah.
The Ferraris, you know, they've got a reputation for building nice cars, but their cars compared to our cars like this one, the bodies look like a sack of walnuts with all kinds of lumps and bumps in them.
Oh, is that right?
That's
interesting.
They had smaller engines and were running on gasoline, but they had 3 or 4 or 5-speed gearbox, so they could accelerate where these only have a 2-speed with the Offie engine.
Sure.
So it took them about a lap to get cranked up and running around there.
Yeah. So this would have been the race of two worlds. It was a race that was originally conceived to put the best American cars against the best European cars, right? And I've read a little bit about it, and I've heard that, you know, the Europeans had a little bit of issue with the fact that the track was set up the way it was. Was there any truth to that, or did they all show up and just kind of give it their best effort?
Well, they gave it their best effort, but their cars really weren't set up for it like ours were. You know, all the Indy drivers at that time ran Winchester and all the high bank tracks in this country in sprint cars, and they were kind of used to buzzing around the track pretty fast and a high bank. And that Monza wall, boy, it was, you know, about a 45-degree wall.
Oh, wow.
And you're bottomed out on the suspension, and the cars were getting so much loading from centrifugal force that the axles were rubbing on the frame, and some of the guys took their belt and put it on the frame with hose clamps and then put grease on it, so when the axle was spinning and rubbing on it, it wouldn't rub a hole in the frame.
Oh, wow.
And the fuel tanks, and this car broke the engine mount and the fuel tank was leaking, and we put some bubble gum where it was leaking and jammed it in there and put some racer tape over it to hold it on and wrapped some wire around it and kept it going, because in the 3 heats you had to finish all of them, and Jim ended up winning the race because he finished all 3 of them.
Wow, that's fascinating, and fascinating story. I know A.J. Watson was a great friend of yours, and if I could wave a magic wand, I would make him appear here with us and talk about not only this car, but the garage that we've created that is obviously all of his stuff. This is all of his equipment out of his last shop that was near Indianapolis, and we were so fortunate to be able to create it you know, the way he left it, you know, and to put a wonderful car here that's on loan from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. And AJ, you've had so many great stories about him as being such a kind guy, but when was it that you met AJ for the first time?
Oh, in 57, 56, 57, right after the tiny Lund stock car deal, but Dick Rathman and drove the first car that he brought up to Indianapolis, a Pots and Pan Special. So they were old friends from California, and Dick's brother Jim drove this car in the race and then won the race. So it was kind of a fun way to spend 2 weeks in Italy.
Yeah, no kidding. Holy mackerel. That's pretty neat. And you know, AJ Watson would go on to be a friend of yours probably for the rest of your life, his life at least. And
well, he was my hero, really. He could build a car, and it was simple, straightforward. He didn't make things overly done with needle bearings and ball bearings, and he'd drill a hole in it and put a bolt through it for the pedal to swing on, and it worked fine. And
sure.
Build a simple, nice, clean car with less frontal area than most of the other cars. and he was just a clever guy, and he was working on the cars at the racetrack and building them. So, as he would see something he could do better, he would incorporate it, and the cars kept getting better, and his cars dominated Indianapolis for quite a few years.
Absolutely, yeah, legendary guy for sure. And there was a neat story you were telling me about his shop, how no women were allowed in his shop. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was very true. And I had just gotten married at the time, and I brought my brand new bride out there, and he said, well, don't let Joyce know that she's hanging around the shop. And she chased down lunches for us and get us things to eat and help where she could. But yeah, it was a different fun life back then.
Sure.
And Watson was such a creative, nice guy that
yeah,
fun to be around.
And a guy that, from everything I've heard about him, you only hear good things. Even from his children. Amy was telling me how he never missed a volleyball game. Even though he was, heavily involved in racing, he also took time for family, which isn't always the case with racers and people involved in the racing world. And so yeah, that says, I think, a lot about him. So you end up working with A.J. Watson and on the Monza car. Then what kind of happens after that?
Well, when I got discharged from the Army, Dick Rathman, Jim's brother that drove this car, got an Indy car for me to take care of. So when I got out of the Army, I came home and he said, here's a Watson Roadster. I drove it last year. We've got a deal to run it at Indianapolis. And we ran it at a couple other races. We ran it at Trenton and Milwaukee and finished third at Milwaukee in the 200-miler.
Wow.
As a prelude to Indianapolis. And then in '61, I was his crew chief at Indy.
Wow, that's amazing. You talk a little bit about having to reinvent yourself throughout the years, and as racing is changing, I mean, there's a lot to keep up with there, but constantly making yourself needed and useful. And what can you tell me about that? Especially having worked for cars racing at Indy, and then moving on to some of the other projects that you worked on.
Well, every car kind of relates to every other car in some way, or has something that would apply to another car to make it better. So I found that it was really helpful to be involved with stock cars, Indy cars, then started building sports cars, Formula 5000 cars, the Helmet Turbine cars, and each one was all the knowledge you learned before applied to that, plus some other new thinking that made it better, hopefully.
Sure.
And more competitive.
Exactly, because some of the cars that you built, that we're going to talk about in a second, were pretty amazing, especially when you get into the sporty cars and you start building your own cars from scratch. I mean, that to me is a really fascinating part of your story. But the way you approached each of these cars, I think, is interesting. We talk a little bit about you being a hot rodder, your Model 8 pickup, and how that kind of launched you into this whole career of motorsport. But you treated each of your cars, when you started building the sports cars especially, utilizing stuff that was available to you rather than just reinvent, and trying to invent your own parts from scratch. And talk a little bit about that, and kind of, well, I guess I'd back up by asking, how did you get involved in sports cars, going from Indy to sports cars?
Well, that was an easy transition. I had gone to several races with the Scarabs. Meisterbrau Beer Company in Chicago was racing them, and I went to Nassau with them. And after the race in Indianapolis with Dick Rathman, Roger Ward was a race winner and drove Watson's cars for a number of years. He wanted to go sporty car racing because he thought it was good to be a varied driver and try different types of cars, and every car you drive you learn something new about. So anyway, he bought a Cooper Monaco from Jack Brabham, and we put an aluminum Buick engine in it and hot rodded it. We put an aluminum Buick engine in it and used the standard Formula One transaxle from Cooper. But it wasn't very adequate. It was hard to change ratios on. So then we ended up designing our own transaxle and made that, and it went in the Cooper. And that worked well enough and people wanted to buy it. So we made patterns and tooling and started manufacturing transaxles. And it was basically a hot rod package. It was a Ford ring and pinion, a ZF limited slip out of a 300 SL Mercedes, a Borg 1 or T10 transmission out of a Corvette, and then Halibrand quick change gears out the back. So you could pull the cover off, put in another set of gears, and in 5 minutes you've got the ratio that's optimum for any racetrack.
Boy, to build your own transaxle, and then the way you talk about it, it's kind of neat, you know, because it is it's a hot rod piece. You know, you've created this thing out of all these different, you know, pieces. It's kind of a Frankenstein, really.
It is,
which is awesome. And you told me, I think last night, you have maybe 45 of those transmissions that were created over the course of...
Right, yeah.
Wow.
We used them in all of our cars for a number of years, and Shelby used them in the King Cobras. A lot of McLarens and Lolas ended up using them. Carl Haas, he was an Indy car owner for a number of years, but he was the importer of the Hewland transaxle.
Oh.
And he brought Mike Hewland to my shop in Palatine, and Mike said, "I'm thinking about building a big transaxle." I said, "Boy, I hope you do, because I'll buy them from you. I'm really tired of putting these together. After you do 40 or 50 of them, you figure
you're ready for the next project.
Better to do than just putting that together." So anyway, we did start using the Hewland gearbox when he came out with that DG or LG 600, and it was a nice big beefy gearbox that I could buy, and we could concentrate on building cars, which I enjoyed more anyway.
Sure. But I would say, if there's anyone watching this video that is really tired of tripping over your McKee gearbox that's underneath your workbench, let me know, because I'd love to put one on display here at the Museum of American Speed and help tell Bob's story a little bit, because I think that's a fascinating piece, just such a cool thing. And I think in your shop you had a picture of an exploded view of that transmission, right, with all the parts laid out. And it wasn't an easy piece. There's a lot of complexity there. And I don't know how many pieces total went into that transmission, but it was pretty fascinating.
A lot of them.
Yeah, oh, unbelievable. So Bob, after you finished the transaxles and you eventually started making complete cars for racing, and tell me a little bit about that transition. What caused you to kind of go down AJ's path and decide, by golly, I'm just going to build the whole darn car?
Well, that's where the dream was, to build a whole car. And because there wasn't a transaxle, we made the one to go in the Cooper for Roger Ward. And then after we had that perfected, and we were selling them all around the country, because a lot of the European cars were getting American Chevy V8s and aluminum Buicks and Oldsmobile engines and Ford engines, and we made the transaxle so it would fit any and every engine. Just
That's great.
Had every kind of bolt pattern drilled in the front faceplate. And so
very cool.
I had a Chevy dealer in my area, and he wanted to build a sporty car, and he was an amateur racer, so we built a car called a Chevette, because it was a hot rod using a lot of Chevrolet and Corvette parts, and he being a Chevrolet dealer, that was a source for anything and everything we needed.
And it's not the Chevette most people are thinking of when we say the word Chevette. This is before that.
Yeah, this was before that name had ever been used. So we called it the Chevette, and we built two of them, one for Jerry Hansen, and he won 9 races in a row with that.
Wow.
But if I'd been halfway smart, I would have gotten a copyright on the name Chevette, because when Chevrolet built the car, they wanted to call their Chevette was going to be a Chaparral, and Jim Hall said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. Give me 10 cents a car that you build."
Oh boy.
And they said, "Oh, we're not doing that." And so the Chevette we didn't have a copyright on, so they named their little car the Chevette.
Oh, that's funny. Funny how that works out. So then, you know, there's this great picture of you, you know, building, I believe it was an early race car where you've drawn all the chalk marks on the floor, you know, how you're going to lay out the chassis. Is that kind of how it started with the early sports cars too?
Well, that was my first one.
Yeah.
And not knowing any better, that seemed like a sensible way to do it, with chalk on the floor and laying all the parts out and kind of sit in it on a box and make sure it will all fit.
Sure.
As I got older and saw that wasn't the answer, I started making drawings, and I'd draw the frame up in 1/4 inch scale, 1/4 inch to the foot. And so we could scale off of that and build the frame on the bench. And then I'd draw the suspension full size, so it was easier to machine it and make the parts and make sure everything was where it was supposed to be. But you know, you had to figure roll centers and anti-squat and anti-dive, and there's a lot of stuff involved in doing a race car besides just fitting the engine and the driver in there.
Sure.
So as time went by, we got more and more sophisticated, and aerodynamics was something nobody knew much about. You know, these cars would fly if they got fast enough, but the shapes, people didn't understand how they would fly, and Marshall Teague got killed at Daytona in the Sumar Streamliner.
Oh yeah.
And it just took off and flew and put him in the wall and killed him. So it was an area that was scary research to try and figure out what to do. But you know, you can take a car like this or any car, Can-Am car, and put yarn tufts on it and tape them on and see where they stand up or go in air intakes. Sometimes you've got an air intake that you think air's going into and air's coming out of, and you say, wow, how can that be?
How does that actually work? Yeah.
But it keeps you humble, because
Sure.
every day you're doing something and learning something new and different.
The complexity of it is just so off the charts, and yeah, I can't imagine that. And, you know, as a race car builder, you know, your interactions, we could talk a long time about interactions with drivers, because I'm sure the input from drivers and, you know, just the personalities of drivers, you know, there's a whole story there. But were there ever times that you just had to get in a car and take it around yourself, or did you kind of stay away from that? Did you ever get behind the wheel personally?
Well, actually I did. In fact, Tiny's Pontiac, we were out at the racetrack here in Lincoln, and I was supposed to meet him there at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I got out there and no Tiny. And so I warmed the thing up, and you know, I'm waiting for Tiny, and he didn't show up. I said, well, I might as well get in and I'll hot lap it. So I'm driving around the racetrack, warming it up. It was a dirt track. And Tiny pulled in the gate, and here I'm roaring around the racetrack. And I pulled in the pits. Tiny said, Bob, you're the mechanic, I'm the driver, so don't ever forget that.
Did that keep him from being late ever again? Or?
No.
Oh, that's funny. Well, you know, your sports cars have a lot of interesting forays into other history too, and you know, tell me a little bit about how Paul Newman got involved. He has this wonderful old movie named Winning, and in that movie he's a race car driver, and the car he's driving is one of your cars. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that car we had rebodied, and it was very much different looking than most of the other cars. It was kind of a wedge shape, looked like a doorstop, and we figured that would give it good downforce with the air running over the top. And actually it did work pretty well that way, but it was different enough that they decided to use that in the movie and have Paul Newman drove it. And that was the first race car that he drove. So it got a lot of notoriety from doing that.
Sure, and he must have enjoyed the experience, because that would kind of launch him into quite a hobby of race car driving, quite a bit of other
for a
stuff.
guy of his age and no previous experience, he really did a marvelous job racing and won a lot of SCCA championships. And he was racing at Sebring and Daytona when he was 80 years old, which, not many people would even consider doing that, but he really enjoyed it.
I can't imagine. Yeah, that's really cool. And then there was another car that had the Smother Brothers involvement. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, well, that wedge car, they sponsored, after the movie.
Oh, sure.
And it was Dick Smothers that was interested in racing, and
yeah,
he was kind of a character also.
What do you think your biggest triumphs were with the whole foray into sporty car building, especially with Can-Am and everything? Is there something that you'd put on your map to say, yeah, that was a moment that really made a difference for me or for my race cars?
Well, I don't know. Ralph Salyer won the SCCA National Championship in one of our cars, and that car I traded him a brand new car for after he'd won the championship, and that turned into the first Howmet turbine car. Mm-hmm. And when we got the order to build a car for Howmet, they didn't have enough time to build a new car, and we had a brand new car sitting in the shop that I hadn't sold yet. Mm. So I traded him the brand new car for his old car, and then we chopped it up and we put a roof on it and gull wing doors and put a turbine engine in it, and I had to design a new transaxle for the turbine engine, and so that was off on another tangent.
The Howmet turbo car, or turbine car rather, that's kind of like, in my mind, just kind of looking at the overall picture, that's kind of like your Mona Lisa, I think. And we'll talk about that car in just a second,
okay,
because that thing's amazing. A very cool car and whatnot. But just kind of to wrap, for the viewers that are watching and for myself, tell me a little bit about what your shop would have been like during the 60s when you're building the sports cars. How many employees did you have working for you? Who was welding the chassis together? And what was it like, if I would have stepped in about the time that Paul Newman was driving one of your cars?
Well, by that time we had probably 6 people working in the shop. It was a small shop. It was 1,500 square feet, which is really small. Mm-hmm. When we expanded and moved to Lake Zurich, we've got 6,000 square feet there, which gives you a little room to spread out. But
sure,
we had all the machines almost on wheels, so we could move them to where each project was and have it handy, so you didn't have to run around the whole shop to grind something or saw something.
Sure, that makes sense. How many cars per year were you making for people? What was the production output?
Well, we'd do, say, 3 Can-Am cars or 3 Formula 5000 cars, but then intermixed with that would have crash cars would have to fix, or something. You're always trying new things, making new trick things to see if it works.
Sure.
And it's kind of a science experiment and see what happens. And so you're always got side things that you're trying to make and try out and see if it'll go better.
When we were driving to the museum today, I asked you, I said, who was the person? You had to have hired a pretty excellent chassis guy to weld, to notch all the tubing and weld, and you raised your hand, you said, I was the guy. And is that true?
Yeah. Well, there were a couple other guys too, but I did, on the early cars, I did most of the welding on them and on the suspension and the frame. But when you only have 2 or 3 people, you've got to do everything that's there. We ended up with as many as 8 people, but that about drove me nuts with so many people and so many projects. It's hard to keep enough jobs going profitably to keep all those people busy.
Well, and not only that, but you told me which kind of hits home because I know this is in fact my case too. You get so wrapped up in running something and interacting with the people that you stop doing the hands-on fabrication and the work that you kind of fell in love with to start with.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I wanted to build cars in the first place. I really enjoyed making parts that fit together and operated the way you planned it to, and there's a lot of enjoyment in that.
See something that you built whiz around the track at almost 200 miles an hour. Speaking of 200 miles an hour, maybe that's a good time to talk a little bit about this turbine car, the Howmet car, and a lot of the pictures say TX on the front, and that stands for Turbine Experimental. Is that correct? And the turbine engine is just a completely different beast. And you know, in sports car racing, I think Can-Am was kind of a no rules kind of thing, right? You could run whatever engine you wanted. You had kind of dabbled with all kinds of things, including building a Can-Am car with a 426 Hemi and a cross ram. And you know, I don't think there's an engine you haven't touched in your career, which is pretty neat. But the turbine car is something that's completely different and unlike anything else that was running at the time. And I call it your Mona Lisa because it's very sought after today, obviously, and people see it for what it is, you know, as being, you know, kind of ahead of its time and you know, very, kind of just a genius approach to building a race car when no one else is really thinking that way. And talk a little bit about what led to the use of a turbine engine to start with.
Well, Ray Heppenstall was a fellow from Philadelphia, and he was involved with Howmet Corporation. They make titanium and stainless steel castings and turbine engine parts. Oh, sure. And so that kind of justified getting off on a turbine engine, and turbine engines put out a lot of horsepower for not a lot of weight. They're very reliable. They have to be so airplanes don't be falling out of the sky.
Sure.
And so it sounded like a good idea. They said they would put up the money to build a car, but by the time they got around to doing that, there wasn't time to design and build a car. So we took Ralph Salyer's car that had won the championship the year before and chopped it all up. I designed another transaxle so that they had a pair of quick change gears at each end of it, and then the engine could sit on top of the transaxle.
Wow.
Because the engine weighs 175 pounds.
Just nothing compared to what a typical engine.
Chevy or a Ford or whatever.
Sure.
And so anyway, we built one of them, and they liked it well enough that they ordered another one right away. So we started building the second one, and we made the wheelbase on that one slightly longer.
Wow.
And because being a coupe, your head can't stick out through the roof.
Sure.
So anyway, it was the head gull wing doors on it that went up like a Mercedes, and
just a beautiful car, you know, and yeah, and that's probably a good time to mention too. You know, you are a guy with a shop with 8 people. You're building things, kind of utilizing parts from all over. You know, different vehicles that you know are reliable, that would work well in a racing situation. But you're really doing battle with these, you know, these unbelievable teams like Lola and McLaren, and you know, that has to make you feel good at the end of the day that you could even, you know, you could even compete with those guys, let alone beat them a few times.
Well, yeah, that's a fun challenge.
Yeah.
When we were running the Howmet car at Le Mans in France, it's a 24-hour race, and the Porsches were breaking hubs. They were using front hubs made out of titanium, heat treated, very, very trick material and hard to machine, and they were breaking hubs. And the head guy at Porsche was talking to Ray Heppenstall and said, "What kind of front hubs do you have on that Howmet car? We're breaking these titanium ones." And he said, "Well, actually, they're 1965 Ford Mustang." And he said, "What?"
Who would think? Oh, that's pretty cool. And you know, the Howmet car, you know, when you watch video of it, you know, it's just a fascinating thing. You know, it's got, you know, with the exhaust ports out the back, and you know, this beautiful scoop, you know, coming up over the cockpit. Tell me the bodywork itself, you know, which is very reminiscent of a Ferrari of that day. Were you building all of that in your shop, or did you farm some of that out?
No, we did all of that.
Wow.
Actually, the fenders front and back were the fiberglass fenders off our Can-Am car.
Okay.
And then we just filled in the front of the hood and the engine cover in aluminum. Howmet also made aluminum.
Oh, sure.
And so they
All
were
that
anxious to
polished
have as
aluminum
much
looked
polished
nice.
aluminum on as we could put on.
Sure.
And so we made all of the door panels and hood and trunk out of, or engine cover out of aluminum.
Wow. How many Howmet turbine cars are in existence right now?
4.
4 total. Okay. And where do they all live currently?
Well, one of them lives in Austria, and they had it at the Pebble Beach concourse about 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
And it won the Chairman's Award,
That's
which
great.
is one of the top awards out there, which amazed me. And you know, the car's worth so much money. When we built it originally, we charged $10,500 for it, and I thought that was a lot of money. But amazing how things change in 50 years or 50 some years.
Man alive. Didn't you say that car was right at the $2 million mark? Is that?
It was about $1.5 million.
Yeah, that's a serious,
More than I ever
serious
dreamed
car.
of.
Oh, well, I just love it. It's a gorgeous car, and it performed well. What was probably its crowning achievement, do you think, in racing?
Well, it's the only turbine car to have won a race.
Yeah.
Some inconsequential SCCA races, but it finished third at Watkins Glen in, I think, a 6 or a 12-hour race. It ran Le Mans, Sebring, and Daytona. It was on the poster for the Daytona race, the first 40-car race they had there.
That's really great. That's very interesting. And you know, the turbine engine itself, being as reliable as it is, you still have to think about, you know, what happens when that thing comes apart. And you said it's not a pleasant experience when a turbine engine comes apart. Is that right?
It's kind of like a hand grenade going off. There's pieces of blade and stuff coming out everywhere.
Did you have that happen when you were involved with the car?
Well, the wastegate was one of the bigger problems that we had,
Yeah.
and it stuck a couple of times. And when you get off the throttle and it still keeps going, it runs into the fence and,
Yeah, that's not a good
and
day.
hurts the car. But
Not a good day at all. And there's someone that still runs a Howmet turbine, is that right?
oh yeah, he runs it very seriously. He's a fellow in France, Xavier Micheron, and he ran it at the Le Mans Classic. He ran it at Monza, where this car raced last weekend, actually.
Oh, is that right?
And it was running 180 miles an hour there,
Wow.
which is scary fast.
And you talk about scary. You know, you had mentioned to me when you're building things that race drivers are getting into and strapping down and relying on it, everything working. You know, that's a little bit of a you know, something on your mind as a car builder. You know, you spoke about, you know, that car, you know, hoping that, you know, at 180 miles an hour everything is safe and working, and but it sounds like your cars throughout the years were that way, really reliable and tough, and never really had a lot of issues with cars coming apart.
Well, we built them a little heavier than some of the others, but the turbine engine was so light it gave us the luxury to do that.
Sure, you can make up for
But
it.
when you're running 6 and 12 and 24-hour races, you can wear out a lot of stuff.
So just kind of closing up, I know we could talk a long time about the turbine car because it's so fascinating, such a beautiful piece of machinery, but is there anything else we'd want to say about it that's of note?
Well, they set a bunch of international speed records for a mile and kilometer with the car, and it's got 6 world records.
Wow.
For turbine cars that the Russians had previously held.
Wow, that's unbelievable. That's really cool. And you know, sports car stuff obviously trickles down in a lot of areas. When I was researching more about you. Of course, we already talk about you a lot around the museum, but if I did a Google search on Bob McKee, the first thing that comes up is a lot of talk about the turbine car, a lot of talk about the sports cars, but the slot car guys just love you. It's amazing how many slot car builders are building McKee slot cars, and you were telling me yesterday too a little bit about Strombecker, and we were talking obviously about Doug Wolfgang, another racer that we had been involved with over the years, and how he acquired the rights to his face and how important that was when he was, selling T-shirts down in the pits. But you had kind of a similar story about slot cars
Strombecker called up and said they wanted to make a slot racer and models of our Can-Am car. And I said, well, is there any royalty involved with that? And they said, well, if you build a car and sell it to the public, then you've lost any royalty that you would get because it's public domain.
Oh.
And had we had a copyright on it, we might have had a better foot to stand on. But anyway, I said, well, in that case, if you won't pay me anything, why don't you come out and you can look at the drawings of the car and measure the car up. Let's make a nice model of it that we can all be proud of.
Sure.
So a couple of their engineers came out and measured the car, and we took the body off, and they came out with a really nice model of it and built slot racers. And it's kind of funny to walk in a hobby shop and see your name on the shelf up there.
I bet.
What's that all about?
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I think that has to be a fun experience. And I always wondered about engineers from Strombecker. What were they like? Were they older guys or were they young pups, or what was? Do you remember much about that?
One guy was older and another guy was young.
Sure.
But that's a pretty tough business. There isn't much margin on that. And,
yes, that's true.
Making the tooling for cars like that in this country is expensive, and a lot of them have all that made in China, which is kind of too bad. But
sure. Well, how nice of you to let them into your shop. I wish I could, have a time machine and hang out and be with them when they came to your shop. I bet that was a fun experience. So, the whole racing thing obviously is very demanding, and there's a lot going on with it, but you were able to kind of reinvent yourself throughout the years, stay relevant and stay connected to the right people, and then that all kind of changed, not in a bad way, but I think there was a time where you just decided, I need to break loose for a while and kind of just change what I'm doing. And you took some time and you did some backpacking and canoeing, and tell me a little bit about that. When did that happen in the timeline of things?
Well, we were building a four-wheel drive Can-Am car, the Howmet cars, a Formula 5000 car, new design, and some electric cars. And we were just buried. They had 8 people working there, and it was just driving me nuts. And we're trying to do all this stuff in a hurry and to keep the price reasonable. And I thought, I've got to do something different. Yeah. And I'd been a Boy Scout, and so I started backpacking with my wife and kids, and we did backpacking and canoe trips and went camping a lot, and kind of got away from it for weekends, and that helped a lot to get things back down to earth again.
Sure, find balance in life a little bit.
Yeah, when you're racing, it's hard to keep an even keel and balance.
Yeah, I told you earlier, I can't imagine you ever getting mad, but I think to your credit, you're a guy that understands yourself and understands when it's time to just call time out and take a breath every once in a while. And I think it's easy to have life blow by so quickly, and when you're busy and you're looking over the next horizon all the time, and what am I going to do next? I know racers in general don't like to look backward very often, and I think you're probably that way, and I hope now you realize that there are a lot of folks that certainly appreciate what you've done and look to your racing endeavors as really monumental, and I think sometimes the mechanic is the person that kind of works in the background and the driver gets all the attention, but when you look at what it takes to achieve what you've achieved, you know, it puts you in awe. I know it puts me in awe, and I told you yesterday I had to pinch myself. You know, hanging out with a guy like you is pretty special, and you know, so I think it says a lot about you that you kind of knew when to say enough's enough. I need to take a break and kind of go and do something else. But then when you came back, you kind of continued down this trajectory of working on electric cars, which that's fascinating. You know, now of course everyone talks about Tesla and everything that's going on with electric cars, but you were kind of ahead of the curve on that a little bit too. You had developed some battery storage technologies which were really interesting. And tell me how you got involved with electric.
Well, Exide, Willard, and Rayovac is owned by ESB. And they wanted to build an electric car. And they called Jim Hall, that built the Chaparral, and gave him a contract to build 2 electric cars. Well, unfortunately, Jim had a big wreck in the Chaparral at Las Vegas and got hurt pretty seriously. And he had to call them and tell them, I'm in the hospital, I won't be able to do it. And so I guess I was the next guy on the list, and they called up and said, would you be interested in building an electric car? And I said, boy, would I.
Yeah.
It's in racing, you've got ups and downs, and you're super busy, and then the next day you've got nothing to do. So this came along at the right time, and it was more money than I'd ever made building a race car. And it just sounded like an interesting challenge, but you know, environmentally it's starting to make sense, and the batteries are improving, and they had a big research department working on new trick batteries. And so anyway, I took the job, and we got thinking about how to do that. And we had built a car for a customer with a backbone frame with all the plumbing for a rear engine, and the water tubes all ran down the backbone frame. And we got thinking, you know, if we built that backbone bigger, we could put all the batteries in there.
Sure.
So we went ahead and drew up a backbone frame, and it had 12 batteries that rolled in, and you could latch them in on latches, and you'd unlatch it and roll it out onto a service cart so you could exchange the batteries, because these were golf cart lead acid batteries, 6 volts, and there were 12 of them in it, 850 pounds. And it seemed like it cured a lot of the problem. It got the center of gravity down low in the center of the car, evenly distributed front to back.
Sure.
And so anyway, I ended up getting some patents on the backbone frame and the way we did the steering gear and suspension. But everything that I'd learned building race cars, where you're trying to keep it lightweight and strong, applies to an electric car, because you've got a lot of weight in batteries, so you need to keep the rest of the car as light as possible.
Sure.
And we ended up building 2 of these little cars for Exide with the backbone frame and a fiberglass body, and we made the frontal area as small as possible, and to get in it, it opened up like a clamshell.
Sure.
And I used trunk or hood hinges off a Lincoln. It was the biggest, heaviest hood going, so that worked and pivoted the top up, and you just step in it like a bathtub and sit down.
Wow.
And so that we got patents on that, and we could build the chassis as a complete drivable unit, and then just drop on like a hat a body
Whatever
that
body.
fit over the backbone frame, and you
Sure.
could change it and make it any kind of body you wanted to. Gives you a lot of flexibility. And we talked to a couple of big companies. They were interested in manufacturing something like that in their snowmobile plant,
Oh.
so they could be building these in the summer and
That's
keep their plant
interesting.
busy. So, you know, this little electric car in 1968 could go over 100 miles at doing the SAE driving cycle.
Wow.
And could go 62 miles an hour. It was 40 inches high, you know, it's only about this high. Had good aerodynamics and smooth on the bottom, and we didn't have anything sticking out that caused turbulence, and so all the race car background
Really
entered
played
into
in.
aerodynamics and high strength materials, and we used a lot of off-the-shelf parts when we could. But we built a lot of electric cars. We probably built 30 different electric cars before we got through.
Wow. When you built the car with the clamshell top and the pull-out battery system, what year would have that been?
1968.
68. So, you know, you're creating this vehicle with 1968 battery technology. Do you sometimes think about if you went back in the electric car business and thinking about it with today's battery technology, what you could do? Because I would imagine, you know, I think even about hot rod batteries, how now you'll have a battery in a tea bucket that's the size of a, you know, a Gatorade bottle.
They're remarkable.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Well, their engineers kept saying, we've got some new batteries coming next year or the year after. Well, here it is, 50 years later, and they're getting the really good batteries with the lithium batteries. And so it is improving, and their lithium's improving, and there's other battery couples. And so, you know, there's a lot of future for it for commuter cars in town.
Sure.
It's the public utilities like it because it uses their off-peak power when they've got all the generating power at night that nobody's using the power.
Sure.
And they'd like to be charging batteries and balance out their load.
Yeah, that's something that I don't think occurs to a lot of people that don't know much about the power grid, is that they do have a lot of off-peak power that just doesn't get used. And you know, people talk about electric cars, especially in Nebraska where we use a lot of coal fire energy, and you know, is there a lot of benefit to an electric car? But I guess thinking about the off-peak power, I would say absolutely, you know, because it gives you a use for all of that. So yeah, it's very fascinating. So you know, I'm sure there are mornings you wake up and you probably think, gosh, wouldn't I love to take another crack at something like that? Or is it the other way around where you're like, I've been there, done that?
Well, yeah, that enters in. But
sure.
If somebody comes up with a new interesting challenge and want to try something and they've got an open mind, I'm glad to take a stab at it. I had a guy called up and he said he would like to build a car, but he knew that building a car with all the regulations was virtually impossible now.
Sure.
With safety regulations and side door beams and headlight and all the things you have to have, and safety crash testing and all of that. And he said, I know that's almost impossible now, but why don't we build a three-wheel car and it'll be a motorcycle. And if you're 3 wheels or less and under 1,500 pounds, by federal standard, it's a motorcycle. So you haven't got all the safety standards to comply with. So he called up and was telling me he'd like to do that. I said, well, that sounds interesting. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I've got a mock-up of what I think we ought to make. I'll bring it up to you tomorrow. I've got a truckload of stuff and I'll be there tomorrow. And I said, perfect. We'd just finished a project and we were sweeping the floor and trying to figure out what in the world are we going to do next. And here he comes and wants to do a project. Well, that ended up being, about a 4-year project.
Wow.
But when he called, he said, I want to build this three-wheeler. And I said, well, you know, that's a pretty serious expenditure and a lot of stuff has to be figured out, made and prototyped. He said, yeah, I realize that. And I said, well, you're probably going to have $1.5 million in it. He said, yeah, that's about what I figured. So I thought, wow, this guy's
he's serious.
He's tuned in and he's ready to go. And so he came up the next day and we started on the Tri-Hawk. And it went through a couple of iterations. We built a couple of tube frame prototypes with the 2 wheels in the front and 1 in the back, and we had front wheel drive on it. And it would corner at 0.91 Gs on the skid pad with Goodyear Eagle tires on it, which aren't super. But anyway, the thing worked, and by doing the prototypes, we kind of zeroed in at what we wanted to do, and then we went to Italy and saw a bunch of the coach builders there, and we interviewed a bunch of people here, and ended up with Dave Stollery as a stylist.
Oh, sure.
And Dave was a California guy. He'd been one of the original Mouseketeers for Walt Disney.
Oh, is that right?
But a very, very talented stylist and designer. So he made a prototype and foam core of the body, and it looked really slick. And we ended up having him make the tooling and make the bodies, and
wow.
We made the frames in Palatine, and I think we built 9 prototypes before we got through.
Wow.
And every time we'd finish a prototype, if we finished Friday afternoon, Saturday morning, Lou Richards, the guy that was sponsoring the deal, he and I would drive it to California, and by the time you drive, 2,000 miles, you have an idea, well, this is rubbing my knee, or I don't like where this is. And
sure.
We were driving over the Continental Divide. It must have been 11 or 12 at night one night, and it started snowing and sleeting.
Oh, jeez.
And he said, I've just rethought this thing. We're going to put a windshield on this and put a heater in it and make it an all year round vehicle.
Sure.
So we ended up doing that and made a nice little convertible top that fit on it. And so he ended up manufacturing those, and
wow.
Built near 200 of them before he got
200
done.
cars, wow. Do you see them for sale every once in a while?
Yeah,
or?
every now and then.
Oh,
but
that's
they're
interesting.
going for more than what they cost new.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
What
40 years ago.
What would have they had for a power plant?
It was a Citroen 4-cylinder overhead cam, air-cooled engine, a beautiful little engine.
Wow.
And just fit in the nose of it, and it was front-wheel drive.
And now you look at all these 3-wheeled vehicles driving around, the newer ones, and you think, gee whiz, you were ahead of your time on that too. It's pretty amazing.
Well, we were front-wheel drive, which really makes it work. And we had 72% of the weight on the front wheels. So
traction wasn't an issue.
Traction wasn't an issue.
That's pretty cool.
He was a neat guy, and it was a very fun project to work on.
Wow. I don't think you've met a person that you can't call a friend. I think that says a lot about you. It seems like with all these projects, you've met so many people, and you have to probably sit back and think some days about all the personalities and the friends you've met along the way, you said earlier when we were walking through the museum that all these stories kind of weave together, all the people kind of weave together, and no man's really an island when it comes to some of the stuff happening. And I guess as we start to wrap up, is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should touch on or mention, do you think?
Oh boy, I really feel very fortunate in meeting so many wonderful people and craftsmen that have helped do all these projects. It was a lot of fun. The customers were fun to work with, and was interesting, challenging work, and I really couldn't have spent my time doing anything more fun that I can think of than making those cars and vehicles and trying new different things.
Most mornings you were probably excited to put your shoes on and go to work.
Yeah.
And I think you had that advice for your daughters and for me and for just about anybody out there, that if you find something you truly love to do, that when you wake up in the morning you're motivated to get up and get out there and do it. As long as you do it well, the rest kind of takes care of itself.
Right,
I think you're a shining example of that. And I think I kind of consider you the Leonardo da Vinci of American race cars in a lot of ways, because you're kind of a Renaissance man in that you've done just about everything, and people hold you in such high regard. I know you're such a humble guy. It's easy to kind of overlook the fact that so many people admire you and think so highly of you, and I hope you know that we're just so so pleased and honored that you would come here and spend the time with us. And he's our Cars and Coffee guest tomorrow, where he'll be speaking to a group of fellow hot rodders, and we just couldn't be more excited. So Bob, I want to, from me personally, from the Smith family, and from everyone here at the museum, just thank you from the bottom of our hearts, for coming and spending time with us.
Well, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, it means
I've
a lot
enjoyed it.
to us.
Okay, thank
Thanks
you.
so much. You bet. Well, thank you everybody for joining us here at the Museum of American Speed. We always love it when you tune in and get to talk to some of our friends, and we hope you enjoy it and join us next time.